Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. We're back in Maimonides Beit HaBechira, the Laws of the Chosen House, back to our Holy Temple Studies, 4th chapter of the Rambam. It's time to actually walk through the entrance of the temple. Indeed, in the next two halachot in the 4th chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira, Maimonides refers to the major entrances to the sanctuary, that is, the entrance to the sanctuary itself, as well as the entrance to the hallway, the ulam, the outer hall, before we actually come to the sanctuary itself. Now, in our last lesson in Beit HaBechira, we just began a little bit to discuss what we find in Halacha Zayin, Hashar Hagadol Haya Rachbo Eser Amot V'Gavho Esrim Amah. The great gate, the Rambam says, it was 10 amot wide and 20 amot high. The truth is, we have a teaching in the Mishnah, in the second chapter, that all of the entrances in the Holy Temple, with the exception of the gateway, all of these entrances were of the same size. They were 10 amot wide and 20 amot high. This was the standard measurements. However, as we see in the language of the Rambam, the gates, the entrance to the Heichal, to the sanctuary, is called the Great Gates. And again, the truth is it was the same size as all of the other entrances, except for the fact that, according to some interpretations, it's called Hashar Hagadol, the Great Gate, because of its importance leading into the sanctuary itself. Others point out, for example, that there is a similar expression we find in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, that describes the Euphrates as the great river, although physically it was not any larger when compared to any of the other major rivers. But the commentaries on that verse explain that the term the great river is used because of its importance in marking the eastern boundaries of the land of Israel. So too, the Shar Hagadol, the gate by which we gain entrance into the Heichal, into the sanctuary, is called so because of its importance. The composition of the gates is in itself very interesting. We're going to discuss that now. First, I'd like to dwell for a moment on where we are, again, in the temple. The next halacha, halacha chet, we're kind of going to be going backwards because we're starting in halacha zayin with the entrance into the heichal, and in halacha chet we are stepping back and we're talking about, actually physically backwards, we're talking then about the entrance into the ulam, the hall through which we have to pass in order to come to the great gate of the heichal, of the sanctuary. So, in terms of the beautiful gates that lead into the sanctuary itself, this is the area where we mentioned previously in passing that we have the decorative golden grape clusters that we learn about. Maimonides explains this in greater detail in his commentary on the Mishnah in Tractate Midot, where he explains that the grapes were kind of symbolic of a blessing of abundance that we are wishing the Jewish people, as it were, in the eyes of the Holy One, blessed be He. And when people would donate a sum to the upkeep of the Holy Temple, that was used to create these clusters of golden grapevines that hung over the entrance to the Heichal, over these gates that we're learning about. And then when the treasurers of the temple deemed it necessary to redeem any of that gold, its value, in order to do some work that was necessary for the upkeep of the temple, then those clusters were removed. This is actually kind of similar to you have today in many buildings, synagogues, and here in Israel as well as other places, hospitals and other places that are built through the dedication and contributions of the community. There's like a donor's plaque in the outer vestibule, in the hallway, perhaps with the listing of all of those people who directly contributed to the building. So the clusters of grapes was a similar idea. Also in this entranceway, within the ulam, but directly over the gates that lead into the sanctuary, we have the beautiful lamp that was donated by Queen Helena. And our sages teach us that Queen Helena was a Gentile queen who embraced the God of Israel. And we have a teaching of our sages in Tractate Yoma about, first of all, her son, who's called Munbaz, King Munbaz, from an area that's today known as Armenia, the mountainous region there. He, King Munbaz, donated the handles of all of the vessels that were used on Yom Kippur. All of the vessels of the handles of all of the vessels that were used on Yom Kippur were made of gold. And King Munbaz's mother, Helene, Queen Helene, donated this beautiful golden lamp that was hung over the entrance to the sanctuary. And our sages teach us that this was like a pure golden orb that was suspended over the great gates to the sanctuary. And as the sun began to rise over the horizon, the outskirts of Jerusalem, when it came to a certain height and the day began to break, the sunlight would shine directly on this golden orb, and beautiful effect would be created of sparks of light that would be emanating from this globe hanging over the entrance to the sanctuary. And the effect apparently was so startling and so visible, even from very, very far away. Our sages teach us that when that moment, astronomically, that particular calculated moment of morning arrived, the sun reached a certain height over the horizon and the rays of light struck the golden lamp of Queen Helena suspended above the doors of the sanctuary. Then all of the citizens of Jerusalem knew that the time had come to read the morning Shema, because after all there is an obligation to read the Shema in the evening and in the morning, and our sages deliberate in the Talmud what is the astronomical definition of morning, for example. When does this moment begin? When it is officially day, and therefore we have the Torah-based obligation of reading the Shema. And there was actually like a signal to the citizens of Jerusalem when the moment came and the light struck the lamp of Helene. The same Queen Helene, by the way, also donated a golden tablet upon which was inscribed the entire Torah portion that is to be read during the incident when the suspected adulteress has to be checked, has to be brought to the temple, and when her words have to be tested. So that entire parsha of the Torah is written on a tablet of gold and was actually affixed to one of the walls of the temple. That was also donated by Queen Helene. And the same source in Tractate Yoma also talks about the famous Nicanor, who donated the great gates leading up from the women's court to the court of Israel. So this is the area that we're talking about, the gates of the sanctuary. And the description, as the Rambam tells us, the great gate was 10 cubits wide and 20 cubits high. And then the Rambam continues and tells us that this gate, the entrance to the sanctuary itself, had 4 doors. There were 2 to the inner and 2 to the outside. And this is the expression of the Rambam, the Arba Dlatot Hayulo. This gate consisted of 4 doors. Shtayim b'fnim u'shtayim b'chutz. There were 2 on the inside and 2 on the out. This actually comes from Ezekiel's vision in chapter 51, where Ezekiel actually tells us, he explicitly describes that there are 2 doors to the temple and to the sanctuary, 2 doors for each set of doors. So basically the concept is that this gate consists of 2 sets of doors. And we have to understand essentially that the passageway which leads from the sanctuary into in other words, from the outside and going in, the width of this passageway is 6 amot. Now from the 2 sides of the of the entrance, of the opening, there are this set of doors. One set of doors opens inward into the hallway, into the ulam, and the other set opens inwards into the sanctuary. Hachitzonot niftachot letoch hapetach lechasot avyo shel kotel. Now, the outer doors opened into the entrance itself, the entrance of the sanctuary, to cover over the thickness of the wall. This is the Rambam's expression. We have to see what exactly is he referring to. Why is it important for him to tell us that the outer doors, when they would open inwardly, they covered over the thickness of the wall, v'hapnimiot, and the inner doors, niftachot letoch habayit, they opened into the sanctuary itself, lechasot acharei hadlatot, to cover over the area behind the doors. We have to see why this is important. So, first of all, understand that the wall that separates between the ulam, the hall, and the sanctuary itself, this wall is 6 amot thick. So, the thickness of the entrance to the gate, the entrance to the sanctuary, is thus 6 amot. Now, the width of the gate itself, the width of the entrance into the sanctuary, we have learned, is 10 amot wide. Thus, each door has a width of 5 amot. Now, the outer doors, which actually open into the ulam, into the hallway, they are opening inwardly, and they cover up the area behind the doors, the area of the wall, which separates between the ulam and the sanctuary, the holy area itself. The second pair of doors, which open into the sanctuary, open inwardly, and they cover over the entire width of the wall. Now, what the Rambam is not citing here is that this halacha actually is based on a Mishnah in Tractate Midot, in the 4th chapter, first Mishnah, actually the source for this halacha, and the issue that is described there, that is discussed there in that Mishnah, is the fact that the entire temple, referring to the second temple, was plated with gold. The walls of the temple inside was plated with gold, except for the space behind the doors. And this is what the Mishnah tells us. There is an opinion expressed that it's actually the opinion of the Tiferet Israel, an important commentary on the Mishnah, that since the Torah itself is concerned with the finances of Israel, it did not find it necessary to cover over the wall behind the door with gold, since when the doors would be open, then that area would not be seen. In general, there is a principle that when the community was able to, when the community had the means, we already learned this in the very beginning of Beit HaBechira, there is actually a positive commandment to beautify the temple as best as possible. So the temple essentially was plated with gold, except for the area behind the doors. So when the doors were opened, they were folded against the wall, and they covered that space with gold as well. So that is why the Rambam describes to us that the doors actually covered over the thickness of the wall, and the inner doors going into the sanctuary covered over the area behind the doors. One question that is raised is why Maimonides himself in this halakha does not cite the fact that the sanctuary was coated with gold. In other words, why is it that we have to cross-reference this halakha with the Mishnah in Midot to try to understand why he has this whole kind of approach to understanding how the doors are working and the area that they're covering? It's been speculated that perhaps according to the Rambam, the coating of the walls of the temple with gold is not a halachic imperative. In other words, it's not something which is intrinsically required, but only if the congregation was able to, and that's perhaps why he did not mention it. in any event, the concept of the sets of doors, the two sets of doors, as we mentioned, is something which is derived from the book of Ezekiel itself, and this is the effect when the doors were actually opened. Yeah. So the eastern wall of the sanctuary, the first 20 amot of the eastern wall of the sanctuary, which is actually half the height of the wall, these 20 amot were not coated with gold, since when the doors would be open, they would be covering that area during the time of the actual divine service. And again, this entire concept of the walls being plated with gold and the effect of the doors being opened in order to cover over the area where there was no gold, and the fact that there was no gold there at all because it wasn't really necessary for the congregation to exert itself to spend extra money to do that, since when the doors were open anyway it was covered. All of this is part of the general halachic principle of beautifying the temple as best as possible within the means of the congregation, but really not going overboard. While we're on the subject of the entrance to the Heichal itself, I want to point out another important aspect of this gate that's mentioned in the writings of our sages, that on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, part of the service of Yom Kippur was the sending off of the Se'er L'Azazel, the scapegoat, into the desert. And we know, our sages relate, that a miracle took place, that when the scapegoat was killed, there was a skein of wool that had been dyed with crimson, which miraculously turned white. And this was a sign that the sins of the people had been forgiven. There were actually two of these lishonot shel zehurit, two of these skeins of crimson wool. One was actually tied to the horns of the animal itself, but another one was tied high up over the entrance to the sanctuary, this very gate that we're discussing. And miraculously, Talmud relates that at the moment that the scapegoat was killed, back in Jerusalem, the twin of that skein, the one hanging in the entrance to the Heichal, also turned white. This was like a signal to all of the people of Israel that were participating in the service in the temple, signal from Hashem that their sins had been forgiven. The next halakha, Maimonides moves on to the entrance to the hall itself. As I mentioned, kind of moving backwards, we're discussing the entrance to the sanctuary. Now we're looking at the larger entrance to the Ulam, and this entrance, as the Rambam tells us, is actually twice as high and twice as wide as all of the other entrances, including that of the sanctuary. Pitcho shel Ulam haya gavoa 40 ama v'rachav 20. This entrance was actually 40 amot high and 20 amot wide. V'lo hayalo sha'arim, and it had no gates whatsoever. This was open. This is also based on a Mishnah in Tractate Midot. Actually, the exact language of the Mishnah is that all of the entrances of the temple had doors, except for the entrance to the Ulam. However, the Rambam himself tells us elsewhere, actually in his Laws of Temple Vessels, he tells us that while there was no door, there was indeed a large curtain that was suspended in the doorway of the Ulam, of the outer hall. You know, you might be familiar with the illustrations and paintings that have been made of the Holy Temple, and you notice that over the entrance to the Ulam, the building of the sanctuary itself, there are kind of these decorative lintels that extend over the entrance. And that actually is not just an artist's conception, that actually is a halakha and part of the tradition of the construction of the temple. And here, the Rambam refers to those decorative lintels, v'chamish maltriot shel milah hayu al gabe pitcho milmala. There were 5 oaken beams that were placed over the entrance to the Ulam, hatachtona odefet al petach ama mizeh v'ama mizeh. Now, the bottom of these beams extended over the entrance to the ulam by 1 amah on each side. V'chol achat michamishatan odefet al shalamata mimena amah mizeh v'amah mizeh. And then as the beams would rise up, the remaining 4 beams, each one extended less by 1 amah, so that the effect was, as we see in these illustrations, from the bottom to the top, or actually from the top to the bottom, they would be decreasing, and the effect would be quite beautiful. And Rambam says, Nimtzeit ha'elyona shloshim amah. So the top one actually was 30 amot long. V'nidbach shel avanim haya ben kol achat v'achat. There was a row of stones between each one of these 5 rows of wood. The Rambam tells us that there were decorative images, floral images that were carved and engraved on these wooden beams. Other commentators tell us that the purpose of these decorative lintels was actually to strengthen the construction, but our basic understanding is that indeed they were decorative. And one question that is actually asked by some of the commentaries is, if you recall, we learned previously, it was actually in the first chapter of Hilchot Beit HaBechira, we learned that there's actually a prohibition against having wood in the court of the temple, against building with wood. And basically the commentators relate to that and discuss the fact that these wooden lintels were not actually protruding. They were, some say they were actually coated with gold, and others say that because they were actually built into the wall of the temple, so they were not categorized as an example of building with wood. Regarding the fact that the entrance to the ulam is really always open, there is a curtain there, but there are no doors. There's actually a very beautiful teaching that refers to this great entrance to the outer hall, to the ulam. It's a Midrashic teaching on the Song of Songs. Our sages tell us that the Holy One himself says, if you would but open up for me an opening the size of the eye of a needle, I in turn would open for you an opening the size of the great entrance to the ulam. And this succinct teaching actually summarizes a very beautiful thought, a very central theme in a Torah life and in our faith in Hashem. And that is that so much of our dynamic relationship with Him depends on us, depends on our motivation, depends on our making the first move. And God uses the example of this incredible open entrance, open all the time with no doors, this entrance to the hall that you need to go into in order to go into the temple, in order to come into His presence. And God tells us, if you would just make the slightest move, if you people would simply be able to find the strength from within to open up and to begin the slightest little approach to me, even if it's no wider than the size of the eye of a needle, I in turn will come to you, meet you, and rain blessing on you and help you. As our sages tell us, whoever comes to purify himself, whoever chooses and desires to be close to Hashem, Hashem draws that person close. So Hashem says, if we would but make that first move that He can't make for us, and even if it's so small and insignificant that it's only the size of the eye of a needle, God tells us that He in turn will open for us in our walk, in our service of Him, in our recognition of Him, in our endeavor to grow close to Him. He'll open for us an opening the size of the entrance to the great hall of the temple, place of the divine presence, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.
Light to the Nations is produced by the Temple Institute, Jerusalem, Israel. Dedications are available for upcoming Light to the Nations teachings. To make a dedication, please visit templeinstitute.org, the multimedia section, Light to the Nations, or email us at temple@temple.org.il. Your dedications help to make these productions possible.